All right, good evening. I'm very sorry for the late start. Thanks for sticking with us. I'm Shanta Trivedi. I'm an assistant professor of law and faculty director of the Sarah and Neil Meyerhoff Center for Children, Families, and the Courts here at the University of Baltimore. To our online viewers, thank you. Welcome. Sorry, we made you look at an empty auditorium for a couple of minutes, but we're here now. And we're really excited to have you with us to kick off our symposium on the harm of removal. I know that you are definitely not here to see me, so I'd like to introduce our authors. First, we have, I have Sandy listed. I'll start with Alan. At the end, we have Alan Dettlaff, professor and former dean at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, and author of Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System, The Case for Abolition. Alan's right, we have Sandy Whitehawk. Sandy is the director of healing programs at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and author of A Child of the Indian Race, A Story of Return. And finally, we have Professor Jane Spinak, the Edward Ross Aronow Clinical Professor of Law, Professor Emerita, since Jane recently retired at Columbia Law School, and author of The End of Family Court, How Abolishing the Court Brings Justice to Children and Families. Welcome. And thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to sit up here with all of you.
Thank you.
So we're going to jump right in. And I just want to ask you all what inspired you or motivated you to write your books. Jane, I'll start with you since you're closest to me.
Okay. I began working on this book about a decade ago. I had been very involved in reform efforts in what we then called the child welfare system. And I believed at the time that family court could be reformed. I thought it could be a better version of itself with more due process, with less discretion on the part of judges, with more evidence in proceedings, less informality. But as I dug deeper into the history of the court, I discovered that people like me were saying these things about the court almost as soon as it had been created. So the juvenile court was started in 1899 in Chicago. It quickly spread in the Northeast and into the Midwest, eventually getting all the way across the country and eventually to the South. And it was started as a court to treat children differently than adults when they got in trouble, and to fix families, fix those children and fix their families. It was a time of progressive reform when there were many immigrants pouring into the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, and the progressive reformers at the time wanted to turn those immigrants into what they considered proper Americans. So the court started as a so-called benevolent alternative, a social court, to criminal court and to treating families in a way that they would get help. And what I discovered, I knew some of that, of course, when I got started, but what I didn't realize was that almost as soon as the court was created, there were people saying, do we really want a court to be doing what this court is doing? Making all those decisions on its own with no law and tremendous discretion. And each decade that followed, people were saying the same thing. Either they were saying that the court needed to be reformed with more money and more judges, or they were saying, well, some of this stuff should happen in the community, because communities are really being impacted very badly by this court. And amazingly, reports in the 1920s and the 1930s didn't use the language of disproportionality or disparate impact, but that's what they were saying. These courts were racist, they were segregated, they were for poor people, they were for Black people, and it was what these families and communities needed was what we're saying they need today, which is an anti-racist society, sufficient income to support their families, childcare, parks and recreation. All of the same things were getting said throughout the history. And so that brought me really to say, well, maybe I shouldn't be writing a book about how to reform family court. Maybe I should be writing a book about getting rid of family court. And that was spurred as well by two other things. One was that the notion of abolition became more than a notion. As people working in the carceral system talked more and more about abolition, and it began to spread, it was then possible to think, well, if we can think about abolishing the carceral system, we should be able to think about abolishing the family court and the family regulation or family policing system. And I would say the last real influence was the activists and the impacted youth and parents who I both knew as clients, but also began to know as activists and advocates in the community and speaking clearly about the harm that they faced and their families and communities faced going through these systems. And all of that combination got me to a point where I felt confident in writing about how we end the family court. And it was timely because many of us are now talking about how to do that.
Thank you. We're going to talk about what it would look like to not have a family court, but we'll get to our dreaming stage when we learn a little bit of foundation. Sandy, what about you? What motivated you to write your book?
The first time. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see all of you here. And greetings to the people in cyberspace. The first time someone said anything to me about a book was about the third or fourth time that I'd gone home. Just as my uncle told me the very first time I met him, you need to come home every year for Rosebud Fair. That's where you're going to meet your relatives. Everyone comes to Rosebud Fair. So I did that. But I would also every year go visit people I'd been meeting along the way. But I would in particular make sure I would visit Chuck Holquin, who was the person who guided me to my uncle's the first time on the reservation in 1988. And I was telling him all kinds of stories of how I met so-and-so, how my sister-in-law was driving me around and just different things and things I was thinking about what it was like to come from white world into Indian world and how much it just made so much more sense to me. And then one time I was visiting him, he says, you know, you really ought to write all this down and write a book. And I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. And did whatever. And I don't know who else read my book, but I did what I always do. Yeah, okay, whatever, that's not me. And then every once in a while I would be asked to give a presentation and someone would say, I can't wait till the book comes out. I'd be like, what are these people talking about? And then, somebody emailed me and said, she's a journalist and says, I really think you need to write this book. And I remember thinking, what book? We haven't agreed on a book. And she just like cold emailed me. And I said, well, I don't know what to do. And she said, just start writing down what the different stories. So I did and just tucked them away because I didn't see a book. I just thought, oh, writing's fun. That's right. I was going to be an English major. So I had fun writing stuff and looking things up, and it was kind of cool to to revisit the memories that I had. That it was just felt good. Didn't think anything of it until well, I did start putting them in chapters and different things, but whoever thinks that's going to be a book. And until a professor friend of mine said, Sandy, have you ever written anything down? What you just said needs to, be written down. And I go, well, I got a PowerPoint where I put all this stuff. I didn't even tell her I had this other stuff. And she said, okay, well, this is nice, but I was thinking more of the details behind this, each of the points you're making in your PowerPoint. And I said, well, I sheepishly sent her what I had. And I think I felt bad because I'm one of those people who still carried education shame because it wasn't completed. And I knew that there were all kinds of grammar, what's that word?
Grammatical.
Thank you. Grammatical errors in the book. And anyway, she just said, her name's Dr. Amy Lonetree, UC Santa Cruz. And she said, Sandy, this needs to see the light of day. And I said, really? Okay, well, like the last section there is a mess yet. And why haven't you done it? I said, because I hadn't experienced everything that needs to be in there yet. And that's how the book came to be. No real big wow moment, just people pushing me along in life, like story of my life. That's it.
Thank you. Some of my students are here and they can let you know that I also make grammatical errors frequently in the classroom. So you are not alone. Alan?
So my understanding of the system comes from my career that started as a social worker working in this system. I actually got into social work because I wanted to work for this system. And when I was in the system, I did what the system calls investigations, and I was responsible for removing children from their parents. And when I was in the system, I thought that I was doing good. I thought that I was helping children and families. And that's really what I think of the system as, and the training that one gets in the system as an aspect of brainwashing now, because it's like a culture of removal, where removal is just the go-to option in every situation. Parents are always viewed as bad, and children are viewed as in need of saving. And I bought into that. I could say that I was young and in my 20s and didn't have a lot of training, but those aren't good excuses. But so my understanding of the harm of the system comes from me coming to understand my complicity in causing harm to children. It wasn't until after I left the system that I came to understand that. And I began to study the problem of racism in the system and how racism impacts decision-making in the system, because I became aware of the overrepresentation of Black children in the system, again, after I left the system, because it's not something the system talks about. But when I looked back, I could see that that's mostly who was being removed. And I did that for probably 15 years, studied the impact of racism, worked on reform efforts, as a lot of people who do this work now did. And ultimately came to understand that the racism is so deeply embedded, ingrained in the system that it would never be reformed away. So I wanted to write a book that exposed the racist intentions of the system and the racist origins of the system. The book was initially called Racist Intents. And that's always kind of still the title to me. My publisher, right before it was published, asked me to he wanted child welfare in the title of the book, rather than in a subtitle, because he said the subtitle usually gets dropped. And if it just said Racist Intents, nobody would know what it was about. And I kind of said, well, Dorothy's book is called Torn Apart. And he said, well, you're not quite Dorothy Roberts yet. So you need to have child welfare in the main title. So that's how the title came about. But I was thinking about the war on drugs when I started writing the book, and what we all know about the war on drugs now, that when it was sold to the population back in the 60s by the Nixon administration, it was sold to us as being necessary to protect us, necessary for our safety, necessary to protect us from bad people and from harm. And we know now, we learned decades later, that was all a complete lie that was sold to the American people. People in the Nixon administration have admitted it had absolutely nothing to do with drugs. The sole purpose of the war on drugs was to lock up Black people, because Black people were viewed as a threat to the Nixon administration. And that's what the child welfare system is. There are no helpful motivations, no benevolent motivations. Everything about the system is built on a racist intention for the purpose of keeping Black families, Indigenous families oppressed. Because at the end of the day, the society and our system of capitalism couldn't continue to exist if there wasn't an exploitable working class to exploit. And so that's what I wanted the book to show, that this was known from the beginning, that there's no such thing as unintentional consequences. And the only way to end the harm that results from that system is by ending it entirely.
Thank you. Sandy, I'm going to come back to you because, yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dave. Always there to help. Jane and Ellen and I are academics and we study history and it's theoretical and, we practice some of it, but it's not our experience. And you and your community are unfortunately a part of our nation's extremely shameful history of family separation. And it's something that you personally had to experience along with a lot of your loved ones. And, why do you think it was important for you to share that very personal experience?
I never said I need to share my story. That never was there for me. It was always an elder who said, keep doing what you're doing. In the very beginning, I didn't even know what that meant. I had no intention of doing any of that. To me, I was just a recovering addict, recovering abusive mother, just found out the beginnings of who I am and what that meant and what I was healing from. So I wasn't like, I have got to share this with the world. They must know. That never came. Literally nudged along. Now I see, as I've put it together, I can see why. But there's nothing special about me per se, as it gives voice to thousands of us, how we were seen as, the reason this even came about, removal, first boarding school, first just killing us, massacre after massacre, that costs a lot of money. So they changed, let's put them in schools because General Pratt said, let's educate them. So they put us in those military schools, which were horrendous, horrible generations of them. But then that got to be expensive as well. And somehow removing us through adoption became lucrative. That's the sole reason in my eyes why that came. It always comes down to the dollar. And so I'm uncomfortable with the thought that, my story alone does anything because, like I said, it represents thousands of us. So, and I think that's maybe the one reason that makes mine a little different is I decided that we needed to use our lived experience to educate through truth, healing, reconciliation forums. And even that was a nudge that I got from an elder. I mean, I'm not that smart, you guys. I did not sit down one day and go, hey, let's do this. I remember Chris Leith telling me, my friend and mentor, he said, if the grassroots people are drawn to what you're doing and approve and give you encouragement, then it'll take place, then it'll happen. And so he taught me, and we traveled for 7 years, and I wasn't writing my book at that time. I was just learning and learning and learning. So there are thousands of us, and in every large city, there are hundreds of Native adoptees wanting to find out who they are and where they come from.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. And I've read your book and you are very smart. And thank you for using your story as a way to shed light on all of those, fortunately, hundreds of thousands of other stories. And I did want to ask, you sort of talked about the process of writing and how you didn't plan for this to be a book. But I wonder what other obstacles you faced in trying to turn your thoughts and your stories into this beautiful book that you ended up with.
Okay, so that's oddly enough, that was just the easy part. The hard part was going through what I went through. People think that I healed as I was going, writing it. No, I don't think I could have done it. It just would have been expletive after expletive. And that part, I'd had enough, what's the word? I'd been down that path far enough to be able, like, where I could be reflective and hopefully be helpful to educate those who are making decisions about our families. And so, yeah, so that was there. And before I forget, I want to say, the cover is my daughter's artwork, by the way. You can look her up. She's a very famous artist. I always say I didn't completely psychologically annihilate her so that she could use her gifts. I say that half jokingly and half real. I think I shared in the book. I can't remember. I cannot remember what all I put in there I don't know if I told this story about how I was able to begin healing from what had done to me that I was doing to my daughter as well. You know, because in our brains as humans, we really do live out what is done to us. And the judges and the social workers who I do train, I always say, I don't know a family who feels good about what they're doing to their families and what they're experiencing, feels good at the end of the day and goes, good, that little shit deserved it and I'm going to do it again tomorrow. I said, they go to bed full of shame because it's not what they want to do. And they don't know how to change that. They don't have the resources to change that. But as she put it very clearly, and as he did as well, nobody cares once you're in court. But we're trying to use our experience to say, no, you need to, every person has, they still got that little flame inside them. And it's our job to ignite that again or build that up and remind them who they are and what they're here to do.
Thank you for that reminder. I think a lot of the times in this work, we kind of focus on the easier cases, you know, the cases that are most sympathetic and that everyone can get behind. And it's a reminder that everyone has the potential to heal and change, you know, and this is the beginning of that conversation. We're going to do a lot of that tomorrow. So stick with us. But thank you for the reminder. Alan, I think for a lot of people, it's really hard to see the connection between historical practices like slavery and separating Native children from their families with the modern day treatment of Black and Indigenous families in our modern courts. You know, so can you sort of bring us from your book to Jane's book and connect those dots for us?
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to talk about because I think we as a public are guilty of a massive disconnect in the way we think about family separations. We know that family separations have occurred at different points throughout our history. And we know that for the most part, family separations began during the era of chattel slavery, where children, enslaved children, were taken away, sold, sometimes murdered by their enslavers for the explicit purpose of maintaining compliance and preventing any kind of rebellion. But we tend to look on that as this historical artifact. Like we recognize that the horrors of slavery, we may know that as many as 2/3 of children during that time were sold, taken away from their parents, but we think of that as an isolated incident. Then we learned about the children who are separated from their parents and put in Indian boarding schools. We learn about the children who were separated from their parents and put in the Japanese internment camps. And then just recently, in the last few years, the nation understood the horror of family separation when we saw that happen at the US-Mexico border. And there was so much outrage about that, protests all across the country, that the policy ended for the most part. And leading up to that, there were psychologists, doctors, pediatricians who were writing letters, putting out statements, signing on to things, essentially saying, one of them explicitly said that family separation is tantamount to torture. And if anyone understood anything about the research on family separation, we as a society would never do that. The entire zero tolerance policy resulted in the separations of about 3,000 children from their parents. Over 3,000 children are removed by the family policing system weekly in the United States. And we barely think about that. We just turn a blind eye to it. And that's why it's important to make these connections, because these aren't historical artifacts. When you really look at this, one, we see that there has never been a period in our history where the government has forcibly separated white children from their families. There has never been a period in our history where the government has forcibly separated white children from their families. So really what family separations are and have been for centuries are a tool used by the government to maintain the oppression of Black children, Indigenous children, Latinx children, for the purpose of maintaining white power, for the purpose of maintaining white supremacy that this country was founded on. And if we don't start making those connections, we're going to continue to repeat that and continue separating children, and there will be an isolated incident and people will get upset and that will stop. Meanwhile, the family policing system operates in the background with this myth of benevolence, and the separations just continue day after day after day after day right in our own neighborhoods.
Yeah. Did you want to, please feel free.
I would just turn to him and said, good stuff, man. I'm on really good behavior, because this topic usually gets me all riled, but I am in a college, so I'm trying to, because I wanted to say,
Well,
I wanted to say right the fuck on, because, and nothing is going to happen. We can have these talks, but we're talking to the choir. We're always talking to people who get it or want to get it. And until we hit the streets, nothing's going to happen. Somehow we have to organize and have a million adoptee march or million something march, because nobody gives a shit, and they're not going to, because it's about money. So thank you. You got me all riled now.
Good.
Well, I mean, because yeah. So anyway, that's what I was thinking.
yeah, I mean, we're all for getting riled up, and we appreciate you getting us riled up. I mean, as anyone who has ever met me knows, this stuff gets me riled up too. And that's why we're here, right? Partly because we want to get riled up, and partly because we do want to widen the conversation. I personally am also tired of talking into an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And we have to start widening our conversations. And I hope that we'll be able to do that at this event. And Jane, you talked a little bit about it, and your book really outlines the history and the development of the family court, and explained that the great idea was that it would be for the family court, was that it would be benevolent, right? Sort of like the idea behind the child welfare system, right? We would have this benevolent system. It would treat children differently, and it would be this therapeutic intervention for youth who were delinquent or incorrigible, or, you know, committed status offenses like drinking or truancy. And you ultimately conclude that the court failed at this and continues to fail, which is a pretty bold conclusion from a professor of law. So I'm wondering how you got to this conclusion, and if you can walk us through. I mean, it's a little more detailed than whatever you're going to say, but if you could walk us through how you got to this conclusion.
Well, one thing I think we don't know about our history, many of us working within the system, is that the juvenile court was the first place for state intervention in families. There were lots of harm done in what was called child welfare by nonprofits, by agencies. The orphan trains actually are the example of immigrant children being removed from their families, but that wasn't actual state action. The first place where the state got that power was in the juvenile court. There was no difference between young people, children who were dependent or delinquent, or what we now call status offenders, which some people don't even know what that is. At the beginning of the juvenile court, whether you broke the law or whether you just misbehaved, you could be brought into court. We separated children who misbehave but don't break the law into today what are called status offenses, but they were all the same at the beginning. And so this intervention in family life didn't require, in some states, it allowed someone who with a reputable reputation to bring a child into court or to send a family into court. There was no law, essentially no law. And as the court developed and became more, it's hard to say more process oriented, because the process that it was oriented toward remained intervening in families' lives. And the treatment that was supposed to be for the child or the family's good was what we have just listened to and what we know, which is that it was rarely treatment for the child or the family's good. What it was intervention in order to control families. And even at the very beginning, there were lots of people saying, gee, you know, they're not jails, but they're detention. They're not prisons, but they're reform schools or institutional schools. So there was a recognition that even at the very beginning of the court, that whatever this benevolence, this social court was supposed to do was not really changing the harm that was happening to these families. Interestingly, sadly, as the court, the court kept doing this, even as it started to separate into different causes of action, let's say. There became a child protection system. There became a separate delinquency system. There became a separate status offense system. There was still almost no due process. And so when the court was finally faced with, and the judges were finally faced with a challenge to that lack of due process by the Supreme Court, that didn't happen until the 1960s. And at the time, what the court said was, in a case that many of you will know called In re Galt, that Gerald Galt, without notice of what he had done wrong, without a hearing, without a lawyer, without any evidence, he was found to have made a lewd phone call. And for that, he got 6 years in the state school. And if he had been an adult, he would have gotten maybe 30 days or a small fine. And so what Justice Fortas said when the case finally reached the court is that essentially it's the worst of both worlds, no due process and no real benevolence. This court does not do what it's supposed to do. And so we layered on top of the court some due process, at least for young people. Still no due process required constitutionally for adults. So parents still do not have a constitutional right to counsel when they are brought to court in a child protective proceeding or even in a termination of parental rights, what we all now call the family death penalty. What was amazing to me following after Galt was really seeing how many places in the country simply ignored it. And the due process that was supposed to be layered on top, maybe in some places, I'm from New York, we have much more due process than most of the rest of the country. Parents have counsel, children have counsel, but in much of the country, children are supposed to have counsel, but they don't. And even in the 2010s, when the Justice Department was under the Obama administration was looking around, it was finding juvenile and family courts that looked exactly like they had before Galt. And so this, I think it's really important for us all to understand that these are not separate systems that are impacting families. This, just like the criminal legal system, has a terrible impact on so many families, so do these different systems in the family court. And in my book, I'm only talking really about 3 of them: the delinquency system and the status offense system and the family regulation system. But as Dan Hatcher, who is here today, has looked at this system and said, yes, and in child support system and in so many other ways in which the family court intervenes in family life, the impact is overwhelming and harmful. So maybe I'll stop at that point.
I mean, I could listen to you for a really. Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned Dan. Hi, Dan. Sandy brings up the money, and Dan has done, just the most amazing work on really
The most amazing work.
how people in not just corporations, but in our judicial system, officers of the court, people at every level are benefiting and making money off of the backs of poor people and off of the removal of children in a way where, I think we all think about this a lot. And I was flabbergasted by Dan's most recent book. So thanks for reminding me to give him a shout out. You guys could talk for a very long time. Sandy, yeah, please.
And let's not forget that we have the Indian Child Welfare Act that nobody does anything with. Now, I don't know, maybe Heather can tell me, I don't know of one judge, one lawyer, or one social worker who has ever been sanctioned for not following the act. And yet you can lose your license if you haven't paid parking tickets. So that's how much they even value our, so what does this law? And that law states imminent harm or danger, which is very different than what most of the removals are over. So nobody gives
active efforts. They're supposed to have active efforts.
And every once in a while you got a judge that's good. For the most part, you have to pull teeth to get any kind of really healthy, good, active efforts. I was the elder in residence at the Equal Law Center in Minneapolis. I think it's the only Equal Law Center in the nation. And they worked really hard and had a great results. However, to do it just is gut-wrenching to get. And I've been privy to comments by non-native social workers and non-native judges, and they just do not want to hear about who we are and what we know will heal our families. It's really sad. And I think that goes back to white society never has made their children the center of their community. Part of the way we know that, at least for me, is they had to pass a child labor law because of making children go work in the factories. Who does that to their child? Their child. Those of you that are parents in here, think about your child going to work in a factory for freaking 10 hours, 8-year-olds. And they had to pass a law for that. Surely they're not going to give a shit about anybody else if that's and then in our communities, every single language speaks to that child is a spirit, is a gift who came from the other realm. to bless us, Wakayaja, the sacred beings. And in every language, that's how children are referred to. And so everything that we do centers around how are we going to make this life and future better for our children. We're always thinking of that. It's a child-centered worldview, and that does not exist in white society. I know you're going to get mad and go, yeah, but we love our children. Well, yeah, maybe you do. But as a whole, as a collective, children are not the center of community. Money is, period.
It's hard to follow you each. I'll say it's hard to interject.
It's his fault. He got me riled.
No, it's good.
She added.
Well, I mean, it's
Good trouble.
yeah.
Yes.
You know, that's sort of where I was going to go, you know, in thinking about, you know, we have ICWA, right? We have these heightened protections for Native children, and yet Native children are still disproportionately removed by family policing systems. Native parents are 4 times as likely as white parents to have their rights to their children terminated. And these are the highest protections we have in child welfare. So I want to talk about what the future could look like, right? Sandy, your community has obviously experienced immense and intergenerational harm. And I know you spend your life trying to help your community heal and to achieve reconciliation. And I was wondering if you could share what that would look like.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is our sovereignty is not recognized. Because if it were, then our everything regarding us and especially our children would be adhered to with respect and asking how they could contribute to that. When I was a commissioner for the Truth and in Maine, I'm going to mess up the title, so I won't say it, but it was on Indian child welfare, and our findings were nothing surprising, but we thought about it when it was time to write our report. And I said, man, this all goes back. We all agreed that our first recommendation was to respect sovereignty. That means we're a separate nation, and we're rarely treated as that in court, in conversation, you name it, we're not. So if there was a more, a deeper respect for our sovereignty, the rest would fall into place, I think. Think so, Heather?
I think for many people who do work related to the family policing system, they think, or I guess, as Jane, you expressed, that the first step towards healing for a lot of families who have been impacted is abolition. And the word abolition really freaks people out. They don't like it. It scares people. Last year we had Dorothy Roberts and Andrea James, and I asked them the same question because we got a strong reaction to, the idea of us speaking about abolition. And I asked them both, and I want to ask all of you, why do people get so riled up about that word? And also, what really struck me in both of your books, Alan and Jane, is that you remind us that these concepts that are central to abolition really aren't new, right? These are things that people have been talking about, like you said, Jane, for a disturbingly long time. And I think everyone just blames the upend movement for spewing abolition. And, why do you think people are so scared of that word? And really, what does that word mean when we say it? Can I start?
Sure. So I would say this is what democracy looks like. Abolition is about equality. It is about fairness. It allows for all families to flourish. It allows for all families to have it's hard to say because it doesn't exist, equality. But for me, it is a mindset toward what would make our society fair, what would allow every person in our society to flourish, to have not be afraid, not think that anytime you need help, you're going to be harmed. And I think that, so for me, it is a mindset toward a kind of democracy in this country that we've never had. And we can't have if everyone cannot participate in the same way. And so it is a road that includes making sure that all families and all communities have what I have the fortune to have. And that requires us to dismantle so much of what has prevented that from being. So I'm looking at one piece of a system that will be very difficult to dismantle, but that I think if we all talk about how do we, abolitionists use the phrase non-reformist reforms, which are reforms that help to take the system apart and not strengthen it. And that's an aspect of abolition. So it's, in very concrete terms, it's not having status offense jurisdiction. Who brings children to court for misbehaving but not breaking the law? I don't want to bring most children to court who break the law, but that's another thing. But all of us as adolescents, there is not a person in this room who didn't do something as an adolescent, me included. I actually said on a radio show to the person who said, the interviewer said to me, well, I never misbehaved. I said, really? I said, underage drinking, underage sex. She said, well, you didn't do that. I said, yeah, of course I did. So did everybody I knew. And I thought, wow, I never thought to say radio.
Oh, you said it twice.
Yes. Well, I'm not on the radio, I hope. But what I mean by that is only some young people who do those things are brought to court. And that's true about parenting. It's true about almost any action any of us take. We mostly do similar things, but some of us are not treated with the respect of believing that we're trying to do the right thing. So for me, abolition is understanding that and then having very concrete steps toward how to make that happen. I am going to mention Dan again because we all have to reckon with that most of us work in this middle class works program. And so we have to acknowledge that we are going to have to change ourselves and change this system in ways that allow people to earn a living, but not do harm. And that, to me, is one of the hardest things to imagine, which is that we can because as Sandy said, it's about money. Well, it is about money. It's about our mindsets as well. And sometimes I actually think we could change our mindset faster than we can change our need for systems like this to employ us all. So So we all have to grapple with, we would be doing a different job. We would be doing different things in order for this to come about. But that's what I hope will happen.
I think when most people today hear the word abolition, they think about the police and they think about the defund movement. The police today exist for the purpose of protecting white property. That's their main purpose. So when white people hear the word abolition, they get scared because their property, their things are threatened. That is not what abolition is really about, but that's what many white people have come to think about the movement, and that's where the fear of the movement comes from. When I think about abolition, I think it's important, as Jane was just doing, to connect it to this historical idea of abolition democracy, which is the idea that today's abolition movement is the same abolition movement as the abolition movement that started during chattel slavery. The movements aren't different. So even when people say things like the modern abolition movement or something like that, it's not the modern abolition movement, it's the same abolition movement. And the reason it's the same movement is because the goals of the original abolition movement were never fully achieved. Abolition was never solely about ending of slavery. Ending of slavery was a means to achieve the real goal of abolition, which was true liberation of Black Americans, true liberation, incorporation into society as full and equal members with property rights and education and access to housing and all of the things that white people had. And because that goal was never reached, that's still the goal that we have today. Full liberation cannot be achieved with systems that cause harm, like the police, prisons, the family policing system. So the movement is the same, but because the movement in many ways is about Black liberation, that's still scary to white people. White people get scared and also get angry when they feel like Black Americans are rising in status, because to them, they interpret it as things being taken away from them. So just a conversation about Black liberation makes white people scared, but that is what abolition is about. And because of that, I don't think we shouldn't be concerned with the fact that people are afraid of the concept of abolition. We know that what we're trying to achieve is needed. And we know that the current systems of harm that we exist in are at a place where they're no longer tenable in a society that works to have some type of justice. So we need to just stand strong and not worry about the fact that some people are scared about it.
I want to follow up a little bit because I think one of the critiques of abolition as it pertains to family policing is that it's not supported by evidence. And people say that if we have no child welfare system, we can't protect children, and children won't be safe. How do you respond to that?
First, just to clarify, it's white people that say that. It's only white people that say that. And they do that to distract those of us who are curious about the movement, trying to learn about the movement, from becoming part of the movement by fear-mongering and talking about children who are severely harmed. We know that only a very small fraction of children who are in foster care today are in foster care because of harm, less than 15%. More than 70% of children in foster care are in foster care because of what the state calls neglect, which is largely related to poverty. So first, it's a means to distract us from what we're really trying to do. When we think about the evidence, though, this whole movement is based on evidence. A big reason why I wrote my book, a big part of Jane's book, is showing the evidence. Because when children are harmed, we need to start by talking about what we know we shouldn't do. And what we shouldn't do is respond to harm in a way that causes more harm. We know that family separation causes immense and lifelong trauma, regardless of how long the separation lasts, even if the separation is a few days, a few weeks. We know that placement in foster care results in severe harm and adverse outcomes later in children's lives. So we know factually, with decades of evidence, that what we're doing now causes immense harm to children. So what we need to be thinking about are ways that we can respond to harm, first We need to stop causing harm to children solely because of poverty. And we literally know how to do that. There was just a news story last week that talked about how child poverty dramatically decreased with the expansion of the child tax credit post-COVID. Child poverty in the United States went down from around 10% to 5%, around 50% decline. Last year in 2022, the child poverty rate went up to over 12% after that 1-year extension ended. So child poverty today is higher than it was pre-COVID. What that shows us, though, is that the government knows exactly how to end poverty and chooses not to. So we can start by addressing those children who are removed for poverty because we actually know how to stop that from happening. When children are harmed, we need to be thinking of ways to respond to those cases in ways that don't cause further harm. And that comes about by, one, not just addressing material issues, but two, shifting power to families and communities and giving the responsibility to families and communities to decide what needs to happen in their families and communities when children are harmed, rather than having the government take those children away.
I just want to add to pick up on what Sandy said about how we don't value children. If we valued children, we would not have the system, not just the family removal system. We would not have a system that allows so many children to live in poverty, to live in segregated lives, to not have health care and child care and parks and recreation and enough food and decent housing. So if we actually cared about children, all those things would be in place. And instead, we've substituted this very peculiar system of blaming families for not having the things that society doesn't provide to them and removing their children from them. So, you know, Sandy's absolutely right. We don't value our children. We would not treat them this way if we valued them.
Speaking of Baltimore residents and Maryland residents, please follow the Maryland Child Alliance, an organization that is trying to end childhood poverty, and Google the Baltimore Baby Bonus. We're trying to get a ballot initiative where every child who is born or adopted, their family gets $1,000, because the research shows that that literally changes the brain development in children and can reduce a lot of the problems that we're talking about as a preventative measure. For more, you can reach out to me. But it's worth thinking that this is we have private citizens. The people who run the Maryland Child Alliance are public school teachers, because they can't bear to see what they see on a daily basis in schools. Shout out to Nate Golden. But, you know, because the government is failing at providing basic necessities to children and their families, and private citizens are stepping in to try to fill the gap. Sandy, while we're on the topic of safety, you write about the myth of safety in adoption. What do you mean by that?
The narrative around adoption is a narrative of saviorism, that white people were going to save Native American children from poverty, that so much so there was such a thrust of removal through adoption that women were approached before their babies were even born, pregnant women, and coerced into signing over their baby before the baby was even born. This was into the early 60s that this was still happening. And that putting a child in a home where there would be guaranteed education, guaranteed two parents, guaranteed, it goes on in that way. When I first was finding out about all this, I thought, well, shit, I was put right in a place that was poverty. My adopted dad died. My mom was not educated. We were very poor and aware that we were very poor. If I for a moment thought I wasn't poor, some kid reminded me that I was poor and that I was not like them. And that, you know, like as I share in my book, and I've met a lot of unhealthy adoptive parents who hold that belief that, you know, what they're providing is healthier, and really not. So I was hearing from so many adoptees their experience. I thought, well, the only thing white people understand is a study has to be on paper, can't be our oral history. God forbid we should just cite a language speaker who carries, you know, generations of knowledge as an authority. So I thought, well, I'll have to, and I didn't want to go back to school. Well, I kind of wanted to go back to school, but I thought, how am I going to do that? I know I will coerce friends who said, how can I help you, Sandy? And so that's literally how I built a team. But so I thought, well, let's just do a study. Let's find out what the outcomes of these placements were for these individuals. And that's where in the book you see basically half of the individuals who were placed in non-native homes were abused physically. Out of the 95 that we looked at, I think it was 24% of them had experienced sexual abuse. And it just goes on. I mean, the suicide rate is much higher. The depression rate is was at 80% nearly. It was just because of that, not having any sense of who you are, not having any sense of belonging. And then I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, you know, this is laughable that, you know, they're guaranteed. And then I thought about it, and in my cynical brain, I thought, oh, it's safer because they're white. And it's like, where is that? You know, what the hell? I don't get. So what I really come to terms with is that the originators of everything that comes down to children was basically, I just keep going back to that. They didn't value children as this gift as we see our children. You know, just as I said in the name, Wakayanja, the reason that it says that a sacred being is, if you've been around a newborn, almost everyone's in awe of a newborn. You're like, you know, and you're just, and we say that's because they just arrived here from the other side, you know, and that's what we're drawn to that. The most cynical person has a second of, oh my goodness. And they have that innocence in them and are here to teach us. We're not here to teach them. They're here to teach us. And that innocence, we're drawn to that. Unless you don't believe that, that you don't care. But that's really sad that that's what that is. But so these individuals who don't understand children are adopting children, and also fulfilling the need for individuals who are infertile, which this makes me really sad to say, but I'm not responsible for anyone's infertility, nor is any child. We got to stop that. We are setting everybody up, the person who's not. And how do you, I would think you would grieve that at some level the rest of your life if you really wanted to have children. But it's not anyone's responsibility to give that to you. It just is not. But it was created in the adoption narrative. And so it's a myth because it is just a myth. There's nothing that I've seen that adoption is better. You know, somebody had said to me, one of my relatives, one of my cousins said, well, yeah, well, you grew up, you guys at least had what, you know, and I said, you don't know what I grew up in. I said, I didn't grow up in any kind of money. I grew up in an all-white town. I grew up in an all-white community, and no, it's not fun. It's awful. Here's the difference. If anybody attacked you or got on you in school, you know, you had your relatives. They'd be right there, right behind you. And guess who I had? Nobody. I had some friends, but they didn't understand me, and I didn't have any way to tell them about me. So there was no protection for me. I was always on my own with any conflict or anything. And so we're given nothing to be who we're meant to be, nothing at all. And so So this myth of safety doesn't exist because people don't know who we are as Native children and who we're meant to become as Native adults, nor would any transracial adoption for that matter. And for that matter, I started thinking about white people that get adopted into white homes. Just because their skin is white doesn't mean they fit in. They grow up seeing that their toes don't look like anybody. Nobody tells them, hey, you walk just like your Uncle John. I was 37 years old before someone told me I was like anybody else in my family. My two uncles and I were talking, and I was chattering about something because I have ADD and I was just going all over the place. And you don't do that with old people. You'd be quiet and listen to them, but I was just gonna. And finally they turned to each other and they started speaking Lakota to each other. And I said, what do you guys, what? And they go, oh, just we're saying you remind us of your Aunt Gladys. And I went, really? I'm thinking, do I look like her or whatever? Then he goes, I said, why do I look like her? And he goes, no, you're spacey, just like her. And I went, all right, okay, I'll take it. I will take it. We don't hear anything like that our entire life. We are like no one. And we're not brought into this world to have that kind of emotional isolation. We are made up to want to connect and have connections. Everything about us is about our connections. So it's just a myth. I'm calling it a myth now, and I hope that you guys call it a myth now. Spread the word, tell everybody that what Georgia Tan was wrong, and everyone who followed her thereafter is wrong. Sorry, I babbled a bit on that.
No. Thank you. Your babbling is really important. We were talking about sort of, how we keep children safe, without a child protection system in the way that we've currently conceived it. And Jane, to you, how do we solve the legal problems of families without a family court?
Well, I think we start with the fact that they're not legal problems. Woo-hoo. Thank you, Angela. There's the social problems I was just talking about, which is most of the families are impoverished who find themselves in family court. They are disproportionately families of color, especially Black families. And now that the federal government has turned over its disastrous intervention to the states, it's disproportionately Native American children. They're not legal problems. Almost nothing that gets brought into family court is really a legal problem when the state is intervening in these families' lives. So much of it is how society fails. And I was really shocked in doing my research to find that in 1990, there was an official U.S. Advisory Board on Abuse and Neglect that said in 1990, this system is terrible, and what we should do is take it apart. We should, and this is amazing, they said we should be supporting families, not reporting families. What we're all saying today, they were saying that in 1990. They were saying that what the families who find themselves in family court need are communities that are able to support them with resources that are accessed voluntarily so that people can trust who they're going to talk to get some support, to get some treatment, so they can trust them, that they're not just going to be reported back to the system. And this is what this official body was saying, is we need to figure out how to support communities so they can support their families and their children. And because they didn't see most of what brought families into this court as a legal problem either. And even a not very popular crime commission under the Johnson administration, their task force on juvenile delinquency basically said about both delinquent kids charged with delinquency and families finding themselves in court that most of them should never get there because they needed supports in the community. So these are not radical ideas. These are ideas that even mainstream, officials have reached those conclusions. So I think there will always be a very small number of cases in which what you need is a very well-structured due process system where if the state intervenes because of an extreme situation, everyone is, you have a judge who believes in the rule of law, you have lawyers, you have hopefully holistic lawyering going on, and so that the family gets as much support while they're going through this system. But you don't need a whole family court for that. You could have a tiny little part of the civil court. And for the kids who have to be in court for breaking the law, one other thing, the international standard for responsibility is 14. We send tens of thousands of little kids into court for delinquency matters. So what you can do is you can have a very small youth part in criminal court and treat children differently, of course. But you don't need this whole court that thinks it's doing good because it's done such harm. So I'm not worried about that.
Jane shares a very disturbing anecdote of 8-year-olds being sent to court for, not for engaging in, but for
Watching a fight at school, Tennessee.
So we were supposed to end at 7:30. We started about 15 minutes late. So we're going to keep going till 7:45. And I do want to leave time for questions. But the stuff we're talking about is heavy. It's often depressing. So I always like to try to end on a positive note. And one theme throughout your books is actually hope. So I thought we could end there with one thing to all of you.
Oh,
If you could share anything that you're hopeful about, and then we'll open it up for questions in the audience.
I was going to say, I know I didn't type that word. Although I am hopeful. I'm always the optimistic person and cynical all at once, if you can be that. I'm always cussing around and then I get hopeful. And I think I have my for sure, my teacher and elder, Chris Leith, who really helped ground me. I remember one time he said to me, "You're so institutionalized, I can hardly work with you." And I was like, whoa, what does that mean? And I didn't ask him because I knew not to, but I get it now. And so when I'm thinking on the worldly side, I just don't think anything will change in my lifetime. And yet, weird things happen. Like, so my research team, I think we have 8 papers out, something like that. And one of them is about foster care, abuse after abuse. And for a miracle, Gorsuch, I can't say his name, Gorsuch, interns found our study and quoted it to uphold ICWA. I was dumbfounded. I was so dumbfounded that I couldn't even, like that day I found out, I was in the woods up north going to go to a big drum ceremony for 4 days. And just before we were going to begin that process, I get that phone call from my friend and I'm like, what? what? And I started crying and I thought, are you from Gorsuch? And I remember when we were listening to them, people kept saying, well, he's hopeful. And I'm like, he don't sound hopeful. Because Heather and I sat in a room and listened to the argument. And anyway, don't get sidetracked, Sandy. So the fact that that was quoted, I started getting phone calls and emails from journalists wanting a statement, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it until the next day after our first day of ceremony. It finally culminated, and I went, man, the people that we have to be thankful for the progress that we have are those first women who sat in court, the place where you're judged the most, the way they dressed, teeth missing, all those things are looked upon as less than, and people look down on you and not understand why you may be appearing the way you are. Those women had nothing. They had no money. They had, I just think of what it would have taken for them to travel to DC, to travel the places that they did. And how do I have hope? I find out that the man who was the head of the Indian Affairs Committee came from immigrant parents, Senator Aberist, who grew up where? On my reservation. His family relocated from Syria to Rosebud, South Dakota. He grew up seeing that we loved our families, that we loved our children, and that we did what we could to provide for them. So when those women came and sat before him, in the archival footage, you can hear him say, you mean they wanted you to sign your child over? I mean, he had that empathy in his voice, which I'm sure encouraged them. And they're the women I thought of on that day, of what it took to do that. And the women had already lost their children, some of them, but they came and testified anyway. And I don't believe we would have had the progress, the success we had he not been head of the Indian Affairs Committee, because he lived with us, he knew us. And when I met him, he greeted me in Lakota and had conversation with what little bit I understood and knew. And so I have hope that no matter how dark it looks, the prayers of our ancestors, as I've always heard, unfold. We just have to keep our eyes open and look to see where that path is lit.
Thank you. Alan, what gives you hope?
I think abolition is fundamentally about hope. Abolition is the belief that the world we wish to see is possible, because the idea that it is impossible is not something we can accept. It's just simply unacceptable. But abolition is big too. And I think that's where sometimes the despair can creep in when we think about how large this movement is and all that needs to happen. So I think where hope comes from is looking for and recognizing the small acts of abolition that are happening all around us all the time. When I think about that, I think about a 10-year-old boy that was murdered in Houston a few years ago. And in his neighborhood, there's a homeless shelter and nearby a residential area. So immediately everyone assumed that a homeless man murdered this 10-year-old boy, and a homeless man was even arrested and eventually released because he wasn't responsible for the murder. But the narrative was that we have to do something about the homeless people in this community. And so there were elected officials and other people outside the committee wanting to increase police patrols in this community while children were walking home from school, because he was murdered on his way walking home from school. So there was this effort to get a larger police presence in the community. And the parents in that community got together and basically said, nah, I think we're okay. And they got together and they formed their own groups of parents and grandparents who sat on their front porches and watched as the children were going home from school because they literally just didn't want more police in their neighborhoods. That's an act of abolition. And those kind of acts of abolition are happening all around us. And it's going to be the cumulative effect of those acts of abolition that lead to the larger change we're trying to see.
I think I'm most hopeful for the way in which young people and parents and families impacted by these systems have led the way. I don't think, I say this in the book, I don't think we'd be talking about abolition. If it hadn't been for that real change, not that there weren't always people wanting to do things, but somehow I think people like me started stepping to the side, started saying, we'll be allies. We're not the leaders. The people who need to be the leaders are the people whose lives are so impacted. And you know, there is a tradition in the law of lawyers, and I hope social workers and others who see themselves as allies and can be there to help in the way the community needs, but not think that their ideas or their conclusions are the ones that are going to work. And, you know, I started as a lawyer 45 years ago. That wasn't really how I learned. And I can see those places during my career when I wish I had learned that better, or learned it at all. But I think always that my clients, whether they were children or youth or parents, were my best teachers to be able to, and I always felt it was very individual, and I don't feel it's individual anymore. There's too much activism and too much advocacy within communities. And I think what we saw during COVID, you know, what was especially meaningful, the mutual aid that went on and the ability of communities to come together to figure out solutions when you certainly couldn't. I mean, mostly you can't rely on the government anyway, but this kind of helped kind of break things open too. So I think that all those combination of those changes, to me, is what's so different from the attempts to change at least the family court in earlier generations, even though people were, there have been plenty of people throughout the history of this court who are professionals or scholars or researchers who identified what needed to change. But I think the change had to come first out of the community. And so, you know, I hope when people like Alan and I get up here, it's with the acknowledgement that these are some ideas we hope get used, but that it's not our place to lead. And so that makes me very hopeful.
Thanks. I think we have time for one question. Morgan State, I know you're in the house. So if you guys have any questions, we have an entire class from Morgan State School of Social Work with us. I didn't mean to put you all on the spot, but. Yes. Do you mind using the mic just in case people are sticking with us on Zoom so they can hear you? No.
Oh,
Okay.
there it is.
Yeah, my question is, because you guys just spoke to that. As a lived experience individual, 11 years of my individual life was spent in the system. Now, being that leader, taking charge and helping other alumni leaders within these different sectors, how do we continue to have that hope when there's a lot of learned helplessness?
Learned helplessness in who?
The individuals impacted and the community as a whole.
Right. I don't know what your community does for a healing event, but what I done in Minneapolis is we come together every month, visit, cry, get mad, heal by just being around and hearing other individuals. And not everyone's in the same place when they come into those circles. Takes, everyone's in a different place. And then for us, we have, events around that, but that's one way. And then I would suggest that's just one way, but what is your thought? What if someone posed that to you, what do you see? And use whatever it is that comes to your mind and to your heart and trust that and move forward. Don't worry about the money. The money never comes. You just got to do it.
I think another piece is recognizing the power that you have and recognizing that the people who want to continue to prop this system up are scared to death of you.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories about your experiences. I'm sure you've seen other panels of people who've been impacted by foster care that the system brings out to talk about their success stories, and they rely on that narrative. And there are many successes, but those stories never talk about the trauma that's underneath any successes that happened, or the reality that all of those youth should have been able to achieve those successes without being taken away from their families. So just recognizing how much power you have and how scared the people who are trying to prop up the system are of you and your experiences.
Thank you for sharing and thanks for your question. And thank you all for sticking with us through a few difficulties. And thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your knowledge and being here with us, and to all of you who are here in person and online. And this is just the beginning of this conversation. We hope you'll come back to us tomorrow, starting at 9, registration at 8, so we can actually get started for those poor people sitting on their couches on Zoom, so we can join together on time. We'll see you then.